Today's daf we're going to learn is Beitzah daf kaf bet. Moadim l'simcha to everyone. Hope you enjoyed sitting in your sukkah after learning all those halachot. Okay, we will get started now. Just a quick review of the end of kaf aleph amud bet. There were three things we saw in the Mishnah that Rabban Gamliel was stringent, like Beit Shammai. We're going to see in the next Mishnah there were three ways in which Rabban Gamliel was lenient against the rabbis. Okay, we'll see the following three things. Right now, we're on the first three here that they're stringent, like Beit Shammai. So the first was Ein Tomnim et HaChamin. You can't, again, what would they do? They would heat up water and then wrap it with towels and blankets and things like that to basically keep in the heat. You can't do that lechatchila on Yom Tov for Shabbat. We're going to see why in the Gemara. We're going to have three possible answers to what's the situation and why. The second is Ein zokfin et menorah b'Yom Tov. You can't pick up a menorah after it fell over on Yantiv. I'll have to talk about why that is. And Ein ofin pitin gritzin ela rikikin. You can't bake thick loaves, but thin ones. What is thick? What is thin? Why? What's the issue? We're going to get to all that in the Gemara. So the Gemara asks at the bottom of Kaf Aleph Amud Bet, Hey Chidami, what is the case? I'm just going to review a little bit. If, and it's the whole question is, did you make an Erev Tavshilin or didn't you make an Erev Tavshilin? So it doesn't make sense either way, because Beit Shammai is stringent, doesn't allow it, and Beit Hillel allows it. So if you made an Erev Tavshilin, Ida Anach Erev Tavshilin, well then my time of the Beit Shammai, of course you can heat up the water because you made an Erev, which allows you to do anything you need on Yantiv that has to relate to cooking for Shabbos, so it should be no problem. If you didn't, then my time at the Beit Hillel. Then why would Beit Hillel permit it? So the first answer we saw last time was Rav Huna says the issue is that you didn't make an Eruv, and yet we still allow you to do basic needs. And this is part of basic needs, to have hot water for the day. So, and this Rav Huna said, and Rav Huna went according to his approach, because he said, if you didn't do an Eruv, we allow you a few basic things. What are those basic things? Ofin lo patachat, at the very end of Kaf Aleph Amud Bet now, you can make one loaf of bread, you can cook one pot of food, umadlikim lo et haner, and you can light one candle. So debate whether this actually means only one candle or maybe candles in general. Candles are part of, if you look at the language of the Eruv, when you put an Eruv, there's a text you say, and it says also, it permits you lahadlik et haner. It seems like lighting candles for Shabbos is part of the Eruv Tavshilin, which you might not have thought. You might have thought it just relates to cooking. It's also part of the Eruv Tavshilin. So there's this debate. If you didn't make an Eruv, are you only allowed to light one candle? Or maybe it just means haner is just in general. You can still light candles because that's a basic need. Mishum Rabbi Yitzchak amu av tolin lo dad katan. So Rabbi Yitzchak added you could even have one small fish. Tanya namihachi, and now there's a Beitzah to support. And here we actually get to the hot water part, because the hot water actually didn't appear in Rav Huna's statement. But there's a Beitzah that says, if you didn't make an Eruv, ofin lo patachat, you can bake one loaf of bread. Tomnim lo k'tera achat, this is all just like Rav Huna said. You can, you can cook. Tomnim here doesn't really mean tomnim. It seems like you can cook up a pot and then wrap it to keep it warm for Shabbos. Umadlikim lo et haner, you can light a candle. And here comes the important one, mechamin lo kiton echad. You can still heat up one pot of water or one jug of water. Okay, that's allowed. V'yesh omrim af tzolin lo dad katan, and some people say even a small fish. In any case, you see here that maybe that's what the Mishnah was referring to, that it was a case where you didn't do an Eruv, and even though you didn't do an Eruv, Beit Hillel permits you still to heat up one small amount of water and do hatmana, wrapping it to keep it hot. And Beit Shammai were stringent and didn't allow it. And Rabban Gamliel did like Beit Shammai and wouldn't allow it. And the case was where you didn't do an Eruv and they didn't think that that was permitted. But Rava has a different answer. He goes with the opposite approach. Rava Amar la'olam shehiniach. You did make an Erev Tavshilin. Now, if you made an Erev Tavshilin, it seems very strange. The big question here is, well, Beit Hillel, we understand you made an Erev Tavshilin. Of course, you could do hatmanat of hot water. However, why does Beit Shammai not permit it? And Rava says the following, which is a little bit strange, and you might be surprised by this. And in fact, so is Abaye, and Abaye rejects it. So don't worry if you're surprised by this, but he says the following. Shani Hatman, he basically says you made an Eruv. What does your Eruv allow you to do? It allows you to cook. It allows you, cook food. It allows you to bake bread, but it doesn't allow you to heat up hot water and wrap it up before Shabbat so it stays hot. Why not? Shane hatmana, it's different than the others. It's clear that you're doing this for Shabbat, because why? On Yantif, you don't need to do hatmana. What is hatmana? Keeps in the heat, right? You don't need to keep in the heat on Yantif because you can just boil up a new pot of hot water. So therefore, if you're doing this, it's clear that you're doing it for Shabbat. Now, if I bake and cook on Yantif, you're not going to, if other people are going to see me, they're going to have no idea, right? It's not clear whether it's other people seeing you or just it's an action that is clearly Shabbat related and not Yantif related, right? Let's say I have my menus. I'm making this for Yantif. I'm making this for Shabbat. So it's clear to me that I'm cooking this just for Shabbat, but nobody else knows that. Nobody checks my list, and it's not a thing that would be noticeable to the average person looking. So therefore, cooking in Erev Tavshilin permits cooking, baking, all things that could be potentially done on Yantif. However, and could be looked at as if I'm doing them on Yantif. I think there's an issue here with the way Rava perceives it is if I start doing something that's clearly for Shabbat, it's almost like I'm belittling Yom Tov because I'm caring more about Shabbat. So to heat up water, to then wrap it and to retain its heat, that's clearly something for Shabbat. That's not included in your Erev Tavshilin. So you can't do something, according to Rava, that's clearly indicative that it's for Shabbat. So again, it's strange because we thought Erev Tavshilin permits anything you need cooking-wise to permit you to do it for Shabbat. So it's a little bit strange here. And in any case, as I said, Abaye is going to reject this. So Abaye brings a question. Eitive always means we're going to bring a question on an Amora from a Tanaitic source. So he says in the following Tanaitic source, and we saw this already, Hananya Omer, remember we brought this very stringent shita of Hananya, the way he understood Beit Shammai. So Hananya says, Beit Shammai omrim, ein ofin elim ken erev bepat, ve'ein b'mashlim elim ken erev betavshil, ve'ein tomnim elim ken ayu lo chamim tmunim erev yom tov. So Hananya said that Beit Shammai says that you have to be very specific in your eruv, right? You have to have, if you want to bake bread, you have to put bread. Or bake, and in general, you have to have bread. If you want to cook, you have to have a pot. If you want to heat up water, you have to have water already put aside, right? With hatmana, with wrapped up before Yantif. You have to basically put aside hot water from before to permit you to heat up water on Yantif. Now, what does this show you? Even according to Beit Shammai, you can do hatmana, right? It's clear. The eruv permits hot water. It's just, Hananya says only if you put up hot water as part of your eruv. But he does think an eruv can cover that, even though it's clear that you're doing it only for Shabbat. So therefore, it's clear from this source that if he had hot water already wrapped up, then he'd be able to take a new pot, heat it up, and wrap it up. So even though it's clear that he's doing it for Shabbat, or she's doing it for Shabbat. So therefore, that can't possibly be what you just said, Rava. So we're going to have answer number 3 again. 3 answers as to why Beit Shammai and Rabban Gamliel was stringent, like Beit Shammai, to not allow Hatmanat Chanim. Either you didn't do an eruv, and he didn't think that that was part of basic needs that we permit, or you're not allowed to do something that looks clear that you're doing it for Shabbat. But Abaye rejected that, and Abaye is now going to answer. Ela Amar Abaye, Kigon she'erev lezeh v'lo erev lezeh v'chananya baliba de Beit Shammai. You can just say that our Mishnah is according to Beit Shammai. Then that means that our Mishnah is according to Beit Shammai, according to Hananya's reading of Beit Shammai, that you have to have for each item that you're doing, that you want to permit, you have to have set something up to permit that before Yantif. And therefore, again, we don't hold this way, right? It's very clear. And Becky, I see your question about candles. We don't hold that you have to do it before. Okay, we don't hold that way. And it happens, we do that before anyway. We light usually a Uricite type candles so that you can have something to, and in any case, you have to have a flame lit from before. That's a separate issue, right? That you're not allowed to just light. You're only allowed to transfer fire. But the point, it doesn't have to be part of your eruv. Okay, you need it. That's just in general, but you don't need to have it as part of your eruv. We don't hold that way. But this Mishnah states that Rabban Gamliel held like Hananya in Beit Shammai, and he was stringent like him to say that you can't be Tomnim and Tachamim if you didn't have hot water mutman already before, right, as part of your eruv. Okay, so that would explain a different way of reading this, but then you'd have to say it's a little bit weak because you'd have to say our Mishnah is like Hananiah's reading of Beit Shammai, which not everybody agrees with, but it's a possibility. Now we're going to get to Ein Zokfin Menorah, and then from here we're going to get off on a big tangent about, in general, putting out fires and putting out things, extinguishing on Yantif, and a bit about Shabbos. It's a little bit of a mix between Shabbos and Yantif here. Ein Zokfin Menorah. So now they ask, my Kavid, what's the problem with Zokfin Menorah, right? They assume it means your candle fell over and you pick it up. So what's the problem with that? Amrav Chanina Bar Bisna, and there's no issue on Yantif, right? Your candles aren't muksa, for example, like on Shabbat, they'd be muksa. On Yantif, they're not muksa, you should be able to pick it up. So what's the problem? So it must be a candelabra that's made of different pieces. Okay, my candelabra for Shabbat happens to be like this, an old style candelabra, and it has a base, and then it has a piece you put into it, right? And sometimes they have even more pieces. There's a nice picture in the Koran, if you have the Koran, of all these different pieces that kind of fit into place, and putting it in place looks like you're building. So if the candelabra falls over and the pieces come apart, you can't put them back together, according to Beit Shammai, and Rabban Gamliel was stringent, like his opinion. What's the machloket? Beit Shammai and why do Beit Hillel permit this? Well, Beit Shammai savre yesh binyan b'kelim, uBeit Hillel savre ein binyan b'kelim ve'ein stira b'kelim. Okay, we've seen this debate before. Is there an issue of building when it comes to utensils, right? Vessels. Building is generally building a structure, right? To build a candelabra, let's say, is not really a problem, according to Beit Hillel. That's not building. Building relates specifically to structures, houses, walls, things like that, not to building kelim. So this, by the way, raises a big issue, because if that's the issue, then why is this an issue? Ein Zokfin Menorah b'Yom Tov. It should be a Shabbos-related issue, not a Yantif issue. It should be a problem, right? Beit Hillel should permit this even on Shabbat, and Beit Shammai, and then therefore Rabban Gamliel should forbid it even on Shabbat. Obviously, if you forbid it on Yantif, you're going to forbid it on Shabbat. But this whole question was a question on Yantif. Tosfos somewhat addresses it. He says that maybe there's gradations of how, there's, right? Like you all know, when you have things that kind of stick together, right? You could have a candelabra like mine, for example. It's hard to call that binyan. That's just putting a piece in its place. That's not really binyan. But maybe one can imagine a candelabra where it's a more serious putting together. And then maybe you'd say that on Shabbat, we'd be more stringent about it, whereas Yantif not. Tosfos tries to make a distinction, which is a little difficult to follow. But the point is that there's clearly an issue here, because Ein Binyan b'Kelim and Ein Stira b'Kelim is really an issue by Shabbat and not specifically Yantif necessarily. So why does it have to connect with Yantif? Anyway, it's a good question. So now the Gemara talks about a story. Ula ikla lebei Rav Yehuda. So now again, we're getting off the topic a little bit, and we're getting into all sorts of candle-related issues on either Shabbat or Yom Tov. So Ula comes to Bei Rav Yehuda, and here we're going to see a Shabbos issue. Kam Shame Zakif Lala Shraga. Ula got to Rav Yehuda's house. He apparently brought his helper with him, his shamash. So what happens when they're in Rav Yehuda's house? The shamash comes and straightens out the candle. Now, candle here is not a candelabra. This is those vessels they would have, like a dish kind of thing where they would pour oil and they would put the wick in. Now, the wick kind of floats around, right? It's not. So in that situation, if the oil is kind of the utensil, the vessel is flat, then the oil will be all over and the wick will be in one part of the oil. So it might go out quicker, right, and not use up all the oil. But if you put it on its side, right, you tilt it a little bit, all the oil is going to go to one place and the wick will be in that place and you'll be able to make it last longer. So what did he do? He straightened out the candle, which basically made it go out quicker, because if it was tilted, right, all the oil will be by the wick. If it straightens out, then the oil is going to be spread all around and it won't necessarily all connect to the wick. So Eitibe Rav Yehuda le'ula. Rav Yehuda goes over to Ula after he sees Ula Shamash do this to the candle, and he says to him, Hanoten shemen bener chayav mishum mav'il, v'hamistapek mimenu chayav mishum mechabeh. Anyone who puts extra oil in a candle, okay, again, a candle is that vessel, is liable for lighting. Now, this wouldn't be a problem on Yantif. That's why it's clear he's talking, at least this source anyway, is talking about Shabbat. Because on Yantif, you actually can add more oil. That's just, right, it's like transferring a flame. You're just making it last longer. That's permitted. But if you take out oil from it, chayav mishum mechaben. Now, this would be a problem on Yantif and on Shabbos because you can't extinguish on Yantif. So he says to him, how is he straightening out that candle when by straightening it out, again, it's the vessel, not I use the word candle because I'm just translating near. It doesn't mean a candle, it means this vessel. Straightening it out is causing it to extinguish earlier. So how could he possibly do that? So Amar Le, what's the best answer? He asked, Lavadatai. My shamash did this. I didn't tell him to do it. Right? The fact that he's doing it doesn't mean I think it's permitted. I don't think it's permitted. I didn't ask him to do this. He did it on his own accord. He was wrong. Right? Well, it's not, don't look at me. I'm not responsible for what my shamash does. It's a good question. Is he or not? Anyway, I'll leave that aside. Amarav, Keniva Share. Okay, Keniva, Rashi explains there's a bunch of different opinions. We'll go with Rashi. Rashi says it means it's somebody who, when the top of the wick becomes blackened, when you light a candle, right, it becomes blackened. If you cut it off, that's permitted. That's not causing it to extinguish. That's actually causing it to burn better, right? Because when it's all blackened at the top and charcoal-like, it doesn't burn so well. So if you cut that off, and it actually helps it. So basically, one is allowed to trim the wick. Okay, now we're going to have a whole slew of sugyot. If you look at the sheet, the way I organize it, I actually thought to organize it, I could have charted it out. I didn't do that. But you can see from the flow that the flow is going to be exactly the same in all the upcoming sections, which is the next few. There's going to be a question, there's going to be an answer, then they're going to question the answer from the same Tannaitic source. So this Tannaitic source is going to be used a number of times. Question, pay attention to who's who, because you'll see something strange in terms of the order of the first one and the second one. He asked Abai the following question. If I want to have relations with my wife, he says to him, am I allowed to put out the candle on Yantif? Okay, what's this question? Why would you be able to put it out? Well, and what's the question? What's the issue with candle and having relations with his wife? So there's a halacha that one's supposed to have relations with one's wife or wife and husband in the dark, okay? Not with a light. So if there's a light in the room and you want to have relations, now the whole question is, we talked about how ochel nefesh permits you to do all sorts of melachot for the purposes of food. But then we also learned that you could do them also for the purposes of warming up, right? Like things that are considered, what the rabbis call it, shaveh l'chol nefesh, things that people need in general. Okay, we're going to talk about some of the more of those later on in today's stuff. So he says, right, maybe having relationships with one's wife is connected to that topic, and therefore one would be permitted to put out the candle for this purpose. So instead of directly just saying no, which he eventually says, because you clearly can't extinguish a fire on Yantif for this purpose, but he starts to tell him, well, I'll give you some other suggestions. Amarlo, efshar b'bayit achel. You can go to a different house and have your relations there, right? It seems strange to go to a friend's house to do that, but probably he doesn't mean go to a friend's house. He probably means go to, maybe you own two houses, so go there. So then he's, so which Abai bar Marta says to him, okay, who are we kidding here, right? Who has another house? Ein lo bayit acher mai. What if you don't have another house? Okay, so Tova, thank you for pointing it out that the article says another room, right? It's possible you could find another space, and maybe that's what they mean by bayit acher. So he says, by the way, it's interesting. Abai, remember, wasn't very wealthy, so it's not like he would say, oh, you have, your summer house or something, go there. Obviously, your summer house is going to be nearby anyway, but okay. So ein lo bayit acher, if you have no other place to go, so he says, efshar la'asot lo mechitza. You can create some sort of, barrier there. Ein lo la'asot mechitza mai. What if you can't make a barrier, build some sort of barrier between you and the candle? Efshar lechapot alav et hakli. So he says, put a utensil over it. Obviously, right? I remember when I was a kid, we always did these science experiments, right? They were trying to teach us about oxygen. And obviously, you'll put it out if you really put a utensil right over it. The point is, you put a utensil maybe with holes in it that it won't put out the fire. If it's going to put out the fire, it's obviously not permitted. So he says, find some utensil to put over it. Amar, ein lo kli mai. He says, what if I don't have that? Amar le asur. Finally, he says, look, you can't do it. Okay, these are possibilities, but if you can't come up with a solution, no, there's no way to do it. To which someone like Abba Bar Marta was waiting for Abai to say this so he could pull out this Beitzah that he had. He says, but wait, you can't put out firewood in order to save it. Like, let's say you want to use it for later. So you can't take it out from the fire so that it won't, right? Because firewood, it's going to burn and become nothing. But it'll just turn to ash. But if you want to save it, right, you're not allowed to take it out because that's basically extinguishing it. However, if you're doing it, that your house is smoking up and you don't want the smell of the smoke in your house, or hakdera, or it's burning your food, then you're actually allowed to take it out. So he says, look, there's certain situations where extinguishing is permitted. So why wouldn't we permit it in this case as well? To which Abai answers, Amalei, Hahi Rabbi Yehudahi, Kikamina Ana L'Rabbanan. Oh, there's a debate about that topic between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis. You're quoting me Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, but we hold like the rabbis. So that's why this really isn't a question against me. So that's Abaye and Abba Bar Marta. Now we're going to go to the next story. Abaye asked Rabba the following question. If you have a fire in your house, you're allowed to put it out in Yom Tov. If you remember, we had this whole discussion by Shabbat. We said only if it's pikuach nefesh, right? If there's a danger to people, right? Nowadays, often, right, any fire really becomes a potential danger to people, and therefore there's ways to permit it. But if it's really, really not, right, then it's a little bit more difficult. Although there's been articles written about this, you can look them up about how to deal with fires on Shabbos. It's a very interesting topic. In any case, the simple halacha in the Gemara is if it's pikuach nefesh, yes, not if it's just your property being destroyed. So now he asks, what about on Yom Tov? And he clarifies his question and says, I'm not asking you in a case where there's a danger to people. I know that that's even right. Even on Shabbat, that's going to be permitted. What I'm talking about is loss of money, right? To protect my property. Again, could you say that's davar shaveh l'chol nefesh, right? Everybody's worried about their possessions all the time, and maybe that's something that we would permit. So Amar le asur. He says, sorry, that's not good. Eitive. So to which Abaye pulls out the same Beitzah that Abba Bar Marta pulled out to him. And it's very strange that he would pull out this Beitzah because what did Abaye say? Oh, that Beitzah is like Rabbi Yehuda. I hold like Rabbanan. So why is Abaye pulling out this Beitzah? So you can think about your own answer. I'll get back to that in a minute. So it says in a Beitzah, but since it's allowed, if the smoke is going to bother you in your house or your pot, it's going to be permitted. So if that's the case, why wouldn't we allow it to protect my property? So Rabba answers Abaye exactly the way Abaye answered Abba Bar Marta and says, don't bother me with that source. That source is Rabbi Yehuda. We hold like the rabbis. So likely, if you remember, Abaye was the adopted son of Rabba. Likely the second story happened first, right? Abaye at first just knew about this Beitzah, quoted it to Rabba. Rabba said, oh, that's Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. We don't hold that way. And then when Abba Bar Marta threw the Beitzah at him, he already had the answer that Rabba had taught him. So even though that story came first in the Gemara, probably chronologically it happened after. And then that makes more sense. Third story with this, okay, and this already we're getting off topic, and as we're already off topic because we were talking about Sefina Menorah, and from there we got into these stories about, about other issues, about candles and extinguishing lights on either Shabbat or Yom Tov. Excuse me. And now we're going to get into a different topic, which is what things one can do for medicinal purposes on Shabbos or Yom Tov. And from there, we're going to talk about, why are we bringing this? Because in the end, it's going to bring the exact same source. Okay, the same Beitzah that we keep quoting is going to be quoted here as well. So Ba'amine Rav Ashi Me'amer and Daf Mishalahen this week, if Hebrew's good, is all about what things one can do for medicinal purposes on Shabbat or Yom Tov, what's permitted and all that, which all comes out of this sugya. Ba'amine Rav Ashi Me'amer. Ma'u l'kol ta'ayim b'Shabbat, Yom Tov, sorry. We're talking about Yom Tov. Can you put kol, was this blue, it comes from kachol, blue powder that they would put, or some sort of eye salve that they would put in their eyes for medicinal purposes. Okay, not makeup like you think of, but it comes up in the Gemara as makeup also, but it was also something they used in their eyes for medicinal purposes. So he says, and then again, he clarifies his question, same structure as before. He says, when there's sakana, when there's life danger, it's threatening, it's a serious, okay, probably not life-threatening, but, it might cause you to go blind or something like that. Kigon, rira, ditza, dama, dimata, kadachta, utchilat, uchlalo mebayali. Not talking about all the following things where you're having, things coming out of your eye and bad infection or some sort of serious issue. I'm not asking about those. Because even on Shabbat, those are obviously permitted. It's when you're at the end of an infection, let's say, okay, where already it's much better, and you just want to put in some more drops, or you're having trouble opening your eye, but I guess I'm not sure exactly what this is, but apparently it wasn't such a big deal issue. Are you allowed to? So Amalei Asul. He says, no, you can't. So again, ATV, we can see where this is going. He brings him a question from the following Beitzah. And they don't even bother telling you the rest. And then they say, in other words, again, brought this Beitzah to say, if you could extinguish, then obviously you can also do this, right? If that's just for a smoky house, then obviously to help your eyes, you should be allowed to. To which he answers, like we answered before, which is, oh, that's only Rabbi Yehuda, not the rabbis, and resolves it in that way. Now we're going to have a bunch of things we're going to see about Amemar and using this eye stuff on Yantif or Shabbat. Amemar shari lemekal ena minochri b'Shabbat. Now we're back to Shabbat. I told you we're a bit zigzagging back and forth. It says, even on Shabbat, you can put this in your eye by using a Gentile, okay? A non-Jewish person can do it for you, okay? Igad Amrei, some people say, not only that Amemar permitted this, but that Amemar gufe kal ena minochri b'Shabbat. He actually did it himself. In other words, not did it himself. He had a non-Jew do it for him. Amrle Rav Ashi la Amemar. So Rav Ashi starts to question Amemar. And he says to him, "My datech, what are you relying on when you did this?" Now he suggests, are you relying on this? And then he's going to say, if you are, I have an issue with this. So what did Ula Berei Ravilai say? I assume you're relying on Ula, Ula the son of Rabbi Eli, who said that any need for a cholek can be done by a non-Jew on Shabbat. And if you're sick in a way that there's no life-threatening situation, you can ask, you can tell a Gentile, can you do this for me? Right? In general, you're not allowed to, we say, Amir la'akum mishfut, meaning it's asur mid'Rabbanan, it's forbidden by the rabbis to tell a Gentile to do something for you. You want the lights on in the room. You can't say, can you please turn on the lights? However, when it comes to a sick person, if they're in life danger, then you can do it yourself. If it's not life danger, then life-threatening, then you can even ask a Gentile and have them do it for you. But that's only the beginning of Rav Ashi's statement. Then he comes and says to him, but Hanemile, it's only when you're not helping the Gentile. Aval mal kamasea bahadeh amitzu patach. Now imagine trying to put something in your eye. If you don't open your eye, then they can't put it in your eye. So therefore, you're in essence helping them, right? What comes to my mind when you go to the optometrist or the ophthalmologist and they want to put drops in your kid's eyes, right? And your kid is like closing their eye as hard as possible, not letting them get the drops in, right? And in the end, right, they have to help. If they don't help, well, we'll talk about this in a minute, but it looks like, right, you're basically helping by opening your eyes. Okay, if you don't open your eyes, they won't be able to put it in. So you're a partner in this, and that's a problem, right? They can only do it for you as long as you're not doing anything to help them. So Amar says, Rav Zvid holds like you. However, and he explained, this case is really, your helping is not really considered something substantial. Why? So I was going back to that example of the child. In the end, right, I've been in this situation. The only thing you could do is literally hold the kid's eyes open, right? Their eyelids and force it in. So theoretically, this, even if you do help them, they actually could do it without your help. So if you're going to leave your eyes open and, help out in that way, it's not really considered sheyesh bo mamash, that there's really something significant to that because it could really be done, right? Maybe in an unpleasant manner, but it could actually be done without you. And therefore, it's misayeh bo mamash. Next case of Amemar. Amemar shar lemikal ena b'yom tov sheni shel Rosh Hashanah. He permitted, remember, he didn't allow it on Shabbos or Yantif by yourself, right? If you're not in a dangerous situation. He only allowed it with a Gentile. However, on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, he permitted it even by yourself. You could do it to yourself, or a Jew could do it for you. Amalei Rav Ashi la Amemar. What are you talking about? Again, Rav Ashi is bothering Amemar with his psak, and he says, "Make b'yom tov rishon." Okay, now this is a good review of the sugya we saw right just before Rosh Hashanah. We learned if a person died on Yom Tov Rishon, right, on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, yit'asku bo amimim, or even the first day of any yantif, right? Then other Gentiles can deal with the body. B'Yom Tov Sheni yitasku bo Yisrael. If it was on the second day of Yantif, then Jews are allowed to do it. And even on 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. But Masha'en came Beitzah. But this is different from an egg. An egg that was born on the first day of Rosh Hashanah is not permitted to be eaten on the second day, because remember we said Rosh Hashanah, whole different issue. It's not sfeik, it's not necessarily sfeika diyoma, and one day is sanctified and the other isn't. It's more that, or it's potentially, right? There's two ways to look at it. Either it's sfeika diyoma, we're not sure which day, or possibly it's yoma arichta. We keep this long day because of the time the Eidim didn't come from Mincha, right? And they said, even if they don't come, then we're going to make both days sanctified. And then we view it as one long sanctification, in which case we're not going to permit anything more on the second day of Yantif, right? We'll allow it when it comes to a dead body because of kavod habriot, for respect for the dead, or kavod hamet, I should say. Kavod habriot is when a person's alive, but kavod hamet, but we're not going to permit it for an egg, and therefore we shouldn't permit it for here as well. So what does he answer him? If you remember, there was a machloket about this. I hold by the opinion that says that Rosh Hashanah, the second day, is just like second day in the diaspora on all the other holidays, and even an egg will be permitted on the second day, and therefore I also permit a Jew to do the eye stuff, the eye ointment. And furthermore, he says, Amemar says to Rav Ashi, and what's your concern? Maybe Elul is really 30 days, in which case, really the first day of Rosh Hashanah isn't really the first day, and the second day is really the first day. Is that what you're worried about? If you remember, we learned this also. This is a good review. We haven't had Elul Me'ubar in many, 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 many years. And therefore, it's just never going to happen. Right? The likelihood of that happening is slim to none. And therefore, there's no way that the second day of Rosh Hashanah is really the first day. And therefore, we can be more lenient when it comes to medicinal issues. Okay, that's the end of, again, let's just remind us how we got here. We talked about the second chumrah of Rabban Gamliel, which was we don't pick up a menorah that falls. We talked about what the issue was, which actually really had nothing to do with extinguishing. But once we were talking about candles, we got into extinguishing, and is extinguishing permitted in certain circumstances. Since in the discussion of that, we quoted this Beitzah, we therefore went to a different topic where they quoted the same Beitzah, and that was about the eye issue on Yantif, and therefore from there, and Shabbos also, from there we got totally off topic. Back to our topic, we're up to the third stringency of Rabban Gamliel. You can't make these thick doughs, only thin. So now they quote a Beitzah, which actually is talking about Pesach. And at the beginning of the sugya, they seem to think that this is a Pesach-related issue, which would mean has nothing, right? When you're talking about dough on Pesach, what are you normally thinking about? Not Yantif-related issues, but Chametz-related issues. So Tana Rabbanan, Beit Shammai Omrim, Ein ofim pat aveh bePesach. You can't make thick dough on Pesach. Ubeit Hillel mitirim. Beit Hillel permit a thick dough. By the way, this is, Ashkenazim and Sfaradim have a different opinion, right? Ashkenazi matzahs are always super, super thin, whereas Sfaradim make them both softer and a little thicker. In any case, all right, some people say it's connected to this. So now, kama pat ava. So it says you can't cook a thick, right? You can't bake a thick dough on Pesach according to Beit Shammai. What's the concern? Because it might leaven, okay? And Beit Hillel permitted. What is a pat ava? How thick is thick that it would be a problem? Amar Rav Huna tefach, shekem matzinu belechem apanim tefach. Rav Huna says it must be a tefach, a hand's breadth. Why? Because the lechem apanim, if you remember, the showbread in the Beit HaMikdash was not chametz. Remember, there's only two things that are chametz: the lachmei todah, right, the korban todah, the Thanksgiving offering, and the shtei alechem that they would bring on Shavuot. Everything else was not chametz. Okay, so the lechem apanim was not really bread; it was matzah bread, but it was a tefach thick. So you see that up to a tefach, it's okay. After a tefach, it's problematic. So now. So Tova, what you're asking is exactly the question. Right now, they're assuming it's Pesach, but we're going to see later, they're going to change the understanding and actually say it's talking about Yantif. It's tricky because if you say Pesach, it seems to mean Chol HaMoed also, right? If you say Yantif, then it seems to mean all Yantifs, not just Pesach. So why is it saying Pesach? So that's exactly what you're asking is exactly really the question of the sugi here. So right now, they're assuming it means a tefach, and it means Pesach, and it has to do with chametz. To prevent it from leavening, it can be up to a tefach, because why? We saw the lechem apanim in the temple was a tefach, and a tefach, and it wasn't chametz. So therefore, it seems up to a tefach, you can make sure it's not going to leaven. More than that, no. So matkefla Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef says, wait a minute. That's a very bad comparison. Why is it a bad comparison? Because he's going to list, I think it's 5 things. Okay, I bulleted them on the sheet. You can see. Number 1, and he's going to basically say, I could see good reason to distinguish between lechem apanim that happens in the temple and other things that happen right outside the temple, like people making matzah. So he says, Imaruba's reason, first of all, the temple, it was all baked by Kohanim. We're very careful to make sure it didn't leaven. But people who are making matzahs maybe won't be so careful because, right, anything the average person does, we have to be more concerned about. So we shouldn't necessarily let them make it up to a tefach if, right, because they're average people and they might not be careful. Number 2, the lechem apanim they would need for a very long time. Once you need something for too, right, you're supposed to need things for a long time, but if you need it too much, you'll ruin, right, it'll prevent it from rising properly. So the lechem apanim was less likely to rise because they needed it so much, whereas a regular dough, they don't need as much, and therefore it would be a problem, right? More likely to leaven. They specifically in the temple use only dried twigs. When you make matzah, you might put some moisture twigs in there. Now, moisture twigs take longer to heat up, which means, again, it might take longer to cook, which means, again, you might have this issue that it will leaven in the process. When you're at home, you might just light up your oven from a cold to hot, right? The first time when you put something, let's say Friday morning, your oven's on all day. In the morning, the first things you cook, it's not as hot. As the day goes on, it gets hotter and hotter. The oven they used in the temple was always lit. So it was always a very hot oven. Whereas the oven in your house or wherever you're making this matzah won't necessarily be so hot. Also, it was made of metal in the temple. Many people's ovens are made of earthenware, of cheres. So because of that, also, it doesn't get as hot. So for all these reasons, one could see a reason to distinguish where there's less likelihood that lechem apanim will leaven, more likelihood that matzah would. So therefore, they reject this understanding that pat avah is up to a tefach based on the lechem apanim. That's not a good explanation. So now we're going to have a different explanation. And from here, we're going to get into that this is a really yantif related issue, and it's not an issue of leavening or not. So Amar Rav Yomi bar Abba. Okay, the way we would understand the machloket before, just to clarify, Beit Shammai say you can't make a pat avah. They're more worried at this, right? The way we understood it is at this thickness of a tefach, they would be concerned that it would be a problem. And Beit Hillel would say, up to a tefach, we're okay. And as Rav Huna tried to explain, we learn from lechem apanim, which Rav Yosef said that can't possibly be. So now we're going to have a different explanation. It doesn't mean the dough, right? What it really meant in the first explanation is when you bake the dough, right? How thick can the dough be when you bake it? Now, Rav Yomi bar Abba, and we're going to have 2 different versions, although they're basically one and the same. It's just a matter of who we learned it from. I asked my rabbi privately about this, Umanu, and who is this? Rav. Okay, his rabbi was Rav. Umay pat ava, pat meruba. It means a large dough, not that it was thick when you went to bake it. It's the dough. You made a big batch of dough, and what's the problem? Then it becomes a yantif issue, right? You can make a huge batch of matzah dough. That's not a problem. But it's a yantif issue that you're basically making more than what you need. Beit Hillel says it's okay. Why? If you remember, we had this whole thing about the bread. If you cook a full oven full of bread, it tastes better than, right? And therefore it is for the purposes of yantif. But Beit Shammai did not permit this. Why did he ask? But Sinai, so you're asking, I don't really know. Okay, maybe he's just telling us this is what happened. I don't know why. So now, some people say, Rav Yomi bar Abba, Amar Rav. He said in the name of Rav, instead of saying, I asked Rav, he said in the name of Rav, that Rav had said, that Rav had asked his rabbi privately, and Manu, and who is that? Rabbeinu HaKadosh. Rav's rabbi was Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. So he had asked Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, so again, it's just a difference of who asked who, and how it was passed over. My patava, pat meruba. It's the same thing. So now they're going to have 2 questions on this. First question. Amai karula patava. Why would you call it thick dough if it's large dough, right? Or sizable dough? You wouldn't call it thick. It's a weird word. So either mishum dinafisha belisha, either because it's thicker when you knead it, right? As opposed to before we thought when you bake it. Or inami ba'atri dahaitana pat maruba pat avakarule, right? Sometimes the language is a little different, the dialect, right? Where he lived, maybe that's what maruba was called ava. Okay, could be they interchange those words. But now is a bigger question. Mirde mishum de katarich tircha delot sarichu my area pesach afilu b'shar yamim tovim nami. There's a yantif issue. Why did it say pesach in the Beitzah? It should have said yantif. So it should have related to all chagim. So answers in achinami, really it relates to all chagim. Vitana b'yom tov de pesach. That Tana happened to be talking about the yantiv of Pesach, and that's why he said Pesach. That was what he was discussing at the time, and that's why. But not really, it's a problem for everything. So now, Tanya Namihachi, and there's a Beitzah to prove that this is really an issue for yantiv in general and not for Pesach. Beit Shammai omrim ein ofim pat meruba b'yom tov u'beit Hillel matirin. But you see two things here. Number one, it's yantiv, and number two, it's pat meruba and not pat ava. So in this Beitzah, it seems like it's a different, right? That's the issue as we explained it before. And with that, we finish this section. Okay, Mishnah. Now we're going to get to three leniencies of Rabban Gamliel, that he went against the rabbis who forbade these things. In Shuli Mishkin's article this week, and Flashback is all about Rabban Gamliel, and she suggests here that it's possible Rabban Gamliel was mekil in some of these issues because he was wealthy and he was from the house of the Nasi, and they always had a lot of guests, and these are somewhat guest-related issues and things that if you have a house that's full of guests and a wealthy home, so there's a certain standard you have to keep to, and maybe that's why he was more lenient. So here are the three. He would sweep the house of the beds, the room of the beds, which really means the room where they ate, because they ate reclining on beds. So most people explain that it means that. There's a bit of a debate, but it means the room where you eat, which would make the most sense. That's the room that needs sweeping the most. The problem with sweeping on Yantif or Shabbos is shavuye gumot. We're worried that the floor was made of dirt and that you might end up filling in holes in the floor. Some people say maybe he thought that in the place where you eat, there really aren't holes in the ground, and because of that, it's not a problem. Or there was a need on Yantif, right? Again, this could come in terms of need and great need, so we allow things like that. Mugmar. This is a bisamim, spices that they would put on coals to cook up, and that would make a nice smell in the house. So he would allow that to make a better smell in the room. Well, although we're going to see what the smell was used for, they would also use it in clothing. So was it for the clothes or was it for the room? You might remember this from Sachim. This is where the way they made the korban pesach was they took out the innards and then they attached it. They roasted it next to it, even maybe on top. Some people say mekulas is like it has a helmet. It's like armored, like a helmet on top, or it was on his sides. Okay, they would basically point is they would eat their meat on Pesach night. They would do it in the way, they would roast it in the way it was roasted in the time of the temple, even though they weren't living in the temple times anymore. The Chachamim Muslim, if you remember, we saw the rabbis forbade this, and you can go through the list now. They forbade this one because it looks like you're eating sanctified meat, right? Ritual meat. When there's no Beit HaMikdash, and people might think even when there's no temple, you can make sacrifices, right? Hard for us to understand that, but after the time of the temple, you can think people might have thought, oh, we're going back to like Bamot, and you can have Mizbachot and things like that, altars. And the Mugmar, again, the Mugmar and the sweeping, right? Either we're not worried you're going to flatten it, or we are worried, right? The rabbis say we're worried you're going to flatten these holes in the ground. And the Mugmar is basically cooking, right? You're cooking spices and it's not for food, so it's a problem. Or maybe we'll see what exactly it is, whether it's cooking or maybe kiboy, extinguishing. We'll talk about that soon. So first, we're going to see Amar of Asi. This whole debate about the gimor, about the spices, the smell, it's for the clothing. But for sure, everyone agrees that if it's a nice smell in the house, of course, it's allowed, because that's part of Ochel Nefesh. Soon we're going to reject this and say that's definitely not the case. But that's what he thinks right now. Meitive. They bring a question against him from a source. This source says, can't sweep, and Rabban Gamliel would allow sweeping. To which Amar Eliezer Bar Tzadok, he had a different version than our Mishnah, and he said, I don't know what you're talking about. I went with my father many times to Rabban Gamliel's house. They definitely did not do this. How do I know? What would they do? They would sweep the floor before Yantif. They would put sheets on the ground. The next day, they would basically pick up the sheets off the floor, and that would clean the floor, so they wouldn't sweep. Amrulo, they said to him, what kind of ridiculous thing is this? If that's the case, even on Shabbat, this is allowed. Why would they do this specifically on Yantif? They would have done it on Shabbat as well, so we don't agree with, we don't believe you. Next case, we're continuing in the same source. So Amar, again, same thing. There's a debate, same as our Mishnah, and comes Rabbi Eliezer Bar Tzadok, and he says, I've been to his house many times with my father. They wouldn't put it on Yantif. What would they do? They would take these coal pans of iron, they would smoke them up before Yantif. They would have holes in them. So what would they do? They would close up the holes, like a basamin box kind of thing. Close up the holes. Right? That would keep the smell inside. They would open the holes the next day when the guests would come. So what do you see? They wouldn't allow it on Yantif. They did it in this way. Now, what's the main point? What do you see from this? Right? I'll get there in a second, but Amrulo in Kenach for Shabbat mutar lasaken. So they said, well, then it's not a Yantif issue. It should be a Shabbat. It should be permitted even on Shabbat. Anyway, the point is, what was their debate about the mugmar here? It was about smell in the house. It wasn't about the clothing. So it seems clear they did debate the smell, because that's what Rabbi Eliezer Bar Tzadok is saying. That wasn't an issue. What are you talking about? But clearly the issue discussed was smell in the house. So therefore, really what you should say is, everyone agrees to put it on your clothing is for sure forbidden. The debate was, can you do it for a nice smell for people? And that's again a debate. Is it shaveh l'chol nefesh? Like we shower nowadays, right? In those days, they didn't shower on Yantif because it wasn't something everybody did on a daily basis. Now people do shower because they say it's something that's shaveh l'chol nefesh, even if it's not food. So this also would be shaveh l'chol nefesh. Last thing for today, they asked the following question: Mahula ashen? Can you smoke up fruits? Okay, because there maybe you can't use smoke for other things, but for fruits, since it's food related, maybe it would be permitted. Rabbi Yomi Amar asur, Shmuel Amar mutar. Rav Huna Amar asur mipnei shemechabeh. So Rav Huna explains why did Rav forbid it? Because when you put, okay, this is like the mugmar, when you put the spices on the coals, it causes the coals to go out because you're putting something cooler onto, right? It causes extinguishing. Amalei Rav Nachman, b'nei marmar b'pnei shemav'ir, but why don't you say because it's cooking up the spices, right? It's firing them up rather than putting out the coals. So Amalei tchilato mechabeh v'sofo mav'ir. First it puts out, then it lights up. It's the first thing that happens when you put the spices on, right? Imagine you put pasta into a pot of boiling water. Immediately the boiling water stops boiling, right? Then the pasta cooks up. So he said, I was mentioning the first thing that happened, even though really both happened. With that, we'll finish for today. We will pick up from here tomorrow. Have a great day, everyone.